As a flight neared its destination, four loud thuds and a squealing of grinding steel echoed throughout the fuselage. Suddenly, the plane pitched downward, zooming toward the Pacific Ocean at a near vertical angle. Fear gripped the crew and passengers, and the pilots desperately tried to recover from the nosedive. As the plane dived, it twisted and turned. The pilots leaned into this, turning the plane completely upside down. The downward pitch relieved slightly, and things started to look more hopeful. Could they do it? Could these two incredible, knowledgeable veteran pilots save their doomed jet? The loss of Alaska Airlines Flight 261 is both gutsy and gut-wrenching. Hopeful, yet hopeless. Terrifying and tragic. The moves pulled by the pilots in this story will have you baffled, and you'll feel empty inside by the time we're done. If you didn't know, one of my greatest fears is dying in an air crash, and I typically fly Alaska Airlines. So let's get traumatized together, shall we? The aircraft involved here was a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, serial number 53077 and registered as November 963 Alpha Sierra. The MD-83 was a longer-range version of the original MD-80, with higher weight allowances, increased fuel capacity, and more powerful engines. This aircraft had logged 26,584 flight hours and 14,315 cycles since it was delivered in 1992. For our flight crew, we had 5 total, 3 Seattle-based flight attendants as well as our 2 very experienced pilots. In charge of the operation was Captain Ted Thompson, 53, who had accrued 17,750 flight hours, more than 4,000 of which were flying MD-80s. He also served in the U.S. Air Force and had flown for Alaska Airlines for 18 years. Our first officer is William Bill Tansky, 57, who had accrued 8,060 flight hours as first officer on the MD-80. He had served in the U.S. Navy and flown for Alaska Airlines for 15 years. Both men were residents of the greater Los Angeles area, and neither had ever been involved in an accident or incident prior to this flight. There were 88 total people aboard, 5 crew and 83 passengers. All 5 crew and 47 of the passengers were headed for Seattle. Of the remaining passengers, 30 were headed to San Francisco, California, 3 were headed to Eugene, Oregon, and 3 were headed to Fairbanks, Alaska. Of the passengers, all were American except one who was British and one who was Mexican. At least 35 of the occupants were connected in some fashion to Alaska Airlines or its parent company Horizon Air, including 12 directly employed. As is common practice among airlines, employees can sit in seats that would have otherwise been left empty, and they also can grant this privilege to their loved ones. Such a privilege would seem like a blessing, and sometimes things are just too good to be true. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Alright, let's get into the accident. On January 31st, 2000, Alaska Airlines Flight 261 departed from Puerto Vallarta's Licenciado Gustavo Diaz Ordaz International Airport at 1:37 Pacific Standard Time and climbed to its intended cruising altitude of flight level 310 at 31,000 feet. The plane was scheduled to land at San Francisco International Airport less than 4 hours later. Sometime before 3:49 p.m., the cockpit crew contacted Alaska Airlines Dispatch and Maintenance Control Facilities in SeaTac, Washington, on a company radio frequency shared with operations and maintenance facilities at Los Angeles International Airport to discuss a jammed horizontal stabilizer and a possible diversion to Los Angeles. So, the jammed horizontal stabilizer was dangerous for a multitude of reasons, starting with the fact it prevented operation of the trim system, which is responsible for making slight adjustments to the flight control surfaces to keep the plane stable in flight. This can result in a serious loss of pitch control that can lead to a dangerous dive, especially if the jam forces the stabilizer to a nose-down position. This also opens us up for the potential of a complete structural failure of the stabilizer. Keep this in mind for later. At their cruising altitude and speed, the position of the jammed stabilizer required the pilots to pull on their yokes with about 10 pounds of force to keep level. This is the same level of exertion you need to lift a gallon of paint or a small house cat. Neither the flight crew nor company maintenance could determine the cause of the jam at the time. Repeated attempts to overcome the jam with the primary and alternate trim systems were also unsuccessful. I said, at the time. Of course, now we know that Alaska Airlines had extended the amount of time that jack screws on the back of airplanes, which in this case was the cause of the jammed horizontal stabilizer, were regularly lubricated, and their inspections, called an end play check, were not extensive enough to find the fault in the jack screw prior to the accident. It would actually open up the floodgates to the FAA on poor maintenance across airlines, and jack screw designs would consequently be changed. Back to our story. The flight crew had several discussions with the company dispatcher about whether to divert to LA or to stay on course to San Francisco. Ultimately, the pilots made the wise decision to divert to the closer airport. The NTSB later found that while, quote, the flight crew's decision to divert the flight to Los Angeles was prudent and appropriate, quote, Alaska Airlines dispatch personnel appear to have attempted to influence the flight crew to continue to San Francisco instead of diverting to Los Angeles. CVR transcripts indicate that the dispatcher was concerned about the effect on the schedule flow if the flight were to divert. At 4:09 p.m., the flight crew successfully used the primary trim system to unjam the stuck horizontal stabilizer. Upon being freed, however, it quickly moved to an extreme nose-down position, causing the plane to nosedive. The aircraft dropped from about 31,500 feet to between 23,000 and 24,000 feet in about 80 seconds. Both pilots struggled together to regain control of the aircraft, and only by pulling with 130 to 140 pounds of force on the controls did they stop the 6,000 feet per minute descent from the aircraft, and stabilize the MD-83 at roughly 24,400 feet. For now. Alaska 261 informed air traffic control of the control issues. After the flight crew stated their intention to land at Los Angeles, ATC asked whether they wanted to proceed to a lower altitude in preparation for the approach. Captain Thompson replied, quote, I need to get down to about 10, change my configuration, make sure I can control the jet, and I'd like to do that out here over the bay if I may. He did so as to not endanger the lives of anyone on the ground, and later during public hearings, his request to not fly over populated areas was mentioned. During this time, the flight crew considered and rejected any further attempts to correct the runaway trim. They descended to a lower altitude and started to configure the aircraft for landing at Los Angeles. But they'd never make it. If you like history and disasters, make sure to check out my other channel, Shipwreck Sunday. I post there every Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Okay, let's look at the final descent. Beginning at 4:19 p.m., the CVR recorded the sounds of at least 4 distinct thumps, followed 17 seconds later by an extremely loud noise, as the overstrained jack screw assembly failed completely, and the jack screw separated from the acme nut holding it in place. As a result, the horizontal stabilizer completely failed at about 17,800 feet, and the aircraft rapidly pitched over into a dive while rolling to the left. The crippled plane had been given a block altitude, and several aircraft in the vicinity had been alerted by ATC to maintain visual contact with the stricken aircraft. These planes immediately contacted the controller. One pilot radioed and said, quote, that plane has just started doing a big, huge plunge. Another reported, quote, yes, sir, I concur. He is definitely in a nose-down position, descending quite rapidly. ATC then tried to contact the plane. The crew of a SkyWest airliner reported, quote, he's definitely out of control. Although the CVR captured the co-pilot saying, Mayday, no radio communications were received from the flight crew during this final descent. The CVR transcript reveals the pilots' constant attempts for the duration of the dive to regain control of their aircraft. After the jack screw failed, the plane pitched negative 70 degrees and was rolling over to the left. Performing an upset recovery maneuver, the captain commanded to, quote, push and roll, managing to increase the pitch to negative 28 degrees. He stated, quote, okay, we are inverted, and now we gotta get it. Over the next minute, completely inverted and still diving at a negative 9-degree pitch, the crew struggled to roll the plane, with the captain calling to, quote, push the blue side of the attitude indicator up. "Okay, now let's kick rudder." Left rudder, to which Tansky replied, quote, "I can't reach it." Thompson replied, quote, "Okay, right rudder, followed 18 seconds later by, quote, "Gotta get it over again, at least upside down we're flying." I can only imagine how the passengers felt, the plane nosediving and then upside down, knowing surely they were not going to survive. The crying, screaming, begging to God for mercy, and the roaring of the plane's descent must have been deafening in those moments. Despite the attempt to fly the plane inverted, which almost entirely arrested its descent, the aircraft had lost too much altitude in the dive and was far beyond recovery. A few seconds before 4:21 p.m., Flight 261 hit the Pacific Ocean at high speed between the coastal city of Port Hueneme, California, and Anacapa Island. At this time, pilots from aircraft flying in the vicinity reported in, with one saying, quote, "And he's just hit the water." Another said, quote, "Yes, sir, he hit the water. He's, down." The aircraft was obliterated by the impact forces, and all occupants on board were killed instantly by blunt force impact trauma. Due to the extreme impact forces, only a few bodies were found intact, and none were visually identifiable. All passengers were identified using fingerprints, dental records, tattoos, personal items, and anthropological examination. For their efforts to save the plane, both pilots were posthumously awarded the Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal for heroism. Rest in peace to the 88 who perished in the crash of Alaska Airlines Flight 261. During the recovery process, the Austin-class amphibious transport dock USS Cleveland assisted in recovery operations. Using side-scan sonar, ROVs, and a commissioned fishing trawler, workers recovered about 85% of the fuselage, including the tail section and a majority of the wing components. In addition, both engines as well as the FDR and the CVR were retrieved. Both the horizontal stabilizer trim system jack screw, also called the Acme screw, and the corresponding Acme nut, through which the jack screw turns, were found. Upon examination, the jack screw was found to have metallic filaments wrapped around it, which were later determined to be the remainder of the Acme nut thread, 90% of which had already worn away previously, leading to this catastrophic failure, which took the lives of 88 innocent people.